Thank you, and hello everyone, and I'm delighted to be here this evening talking to you. Thank you to the Society for asking me to speak. So as you heard, I'm Caroline Brown and I work at the University of Dundee Archives. I'm going to be talking to a PowerPoint this evening, so I'm just going to zoom myself up into the corner of your screen so you can see my PowerPoint. So here we go. Right, so as you know, I'm talking on behalf of the Scottish Records Association, and for me that's really important because I think the Scottish Records Association is important in terms of the fact that it's a body that brings together creators of archives, users of our archives, owners of archives and keepers of archives. And that really brings home to me the fact that archives are for everybody. As an archivist, I'm responsible for preserving records, and I'm really passionate, and I think all of our profession are passionate about the potential relevance of archives for all, not just those interested in the past. Because you all know that archives help us understand where we come from, but they can also impact directly on our present, and they can change what we think about the future and where we're going to in the future. And I hope to be able to, in the next 45 minutes or so, to give you some examples of this. So at Dundee we do quite a lot of talking to groups and quite a lot of teaching and sessions with students, undergraduates and postgraduates. And sometimes to introduce the concept of archives, I get them to imagine that they're standing outside a forgotten or a secret door that is in the house of a famous person from the past. And we have conversations about the kinds of things that might be behind that door. So let's do that just now. Imagine that for some reason you've bought Winston Churchill's last house in London and you're wandering around the basement and you come across this key, and after a little bit more searching you see this hidden door that you'd never noticed before, covered in cobwebs. Now I'm assuming that you haven't been watching horror films and you're perfectly fine about wandering around basements and finding secret doors, but you scrub the cobwebs off the door and you see it labelled file room. So Winston Churchill's secret file room. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you hoping to find in there? Well, hopefully you're feeling a sense of excitement. And when you put the key in the lock and you turn the handle and you open that door, this is what you find. Now at this point with some students I can sense somewhat of a disappointment that they're just finding these piles of old folders, but anyone who's worked with archives will know that this is actually pretty exciting. You might have a sense of wonder, you might have a thrill because of potential discoveries that you'll make. You might just be excited about the opportunity to come face to face with the past. Because anyone who's worked with archives knows the excitement of handling the past and the emotional power that this can bring. And this exercise gives students a sense of that anticipation and a sense of that excitement. And actually, incidentally, it's also really a good exercise in terms of thinking what you bring to the archive, the expectations and the assumptions that you'll bring, what you're hoping to find when you open that door, and how that hope can impact on what you see there and what you understand and what you remember about that archive. So let's take it a step further. Imagine that the door belongs to Tony Blair. Same scenario, you've bought his house, you're wandering around the basement, you find the key, you open the door. What are you wanting to find? Well, we all might be wanting to find different things, perhaps depending on our political persuasion, but this is what you find. Perhaps not as emotionally powerful as Winston Churchill's secret room, but this to me is no less exciting because there might be all sorts of things on these drives, on these disks, on these computers that document past activity but also will have an impact on people's lives today. Just because it's digital doesn't mean to say it's not archival, it doesn't mean to say it's important, and it doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have power. So in this talk I'm going to try and give some examples of this connection between archives and power. And I'm going to start with something that's very much in the news today that you may have seen. So this tweet from the team at Have I Got News For You? I'll just let you read it. Now this points to serious discussions that have been going on in the media and elsewhere about what will form Trump's presidential library, what form it will take, even if there will be one at all. Presidential libraries, as I'm sure you know, gather together the records and archives and museum items of former presidents and form a kind of research centre around this material. Now, on the 22nd of January, the Politico website questioned whether Trump would actually want a library at all, whether he'd actually spend money on such a resource, because presidents, it's the presidential responsibility to fundraise for their own libraries. And they questioned whether he would be willing to support an archive which would basically hold his actions up for scrutiny and in fact hold the whole administration to account. And some people have questioned whether there would actually be anything to put in the library, because there have been questions over whether or not Trump was keeping his records or keeping his archives, keeping a true record of his administration. And certainly those of you who have seen, sorry, I'll go the other way, those of you who have seen some of the news items from the beginning of Trump's presidency will have heard those stories about Trump ripping up some of his documents and then his aides later having to put them back together with sticky tape. And he was actually employing people to do that. So would he want a library? Or is it the case, as the Washington Post suggested, that he shouldn't actually be allowed to have a library at all? Because the Washington Post argued that presidential libraries and archives aren't just about preserving evidence of activity. They're about more than that. They're about creating an image for a president. They're about memorialising him. They're about a symbol of what his presidency was like. And there were fears that Trump would create an archive that would glorify his presidency. And in fact, there have been several kind of spoof Donald Trump libraries online. And I'm just going to show you one example now. So here it is. This is the Donald Trump Presidential Library. And as you can see, there's an area for exhibits. There's a wall of criminality. You can tell which side of the political fence the person who put this together sits on. There's information about tax evasion and so on. But it may be a spoof, but the conversations around this have been very serious. But in fact, Trump moved out the White House, as you know, and as you can see from this Reuters image here, items were packaged up and clearly labelled, clearly intended for a presidential library. And in fact, staff at NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration in America, were on hand to take custody of this material. And you can see here some of the things that were in the boxes, some of this kind of eclectic mix that archivists have to deal with when they take on new collections. I'm sure those of you who are archivists have come across boxes full of tea bags and biscuits, and I remember famously finding a whiskey bottle down the back of a filing cabinet. The great strange amount of different items that you might find in an archive, but I must admit I've never found this, which is a person from NARA carrying a large hammer engraved with the word Trump. So Trump has a presidential hammer, who knew that? But during this debate, what I found interesting is that a lot of commentators haven't mentioned that Trump's predecessor, President Obama, actually caused quite a lot of controversy by breaking with tradition and deciding that he wasn't going to have a presidential library. He was actually going to have a presidential centre that wouldn't contain his archives and records, and that those would be left with the National Archives, with NARA. Some commentators worried that this would limit the opportunities of building up a sort of substantial research centre that often goes with presidential libraries. But in fact, the decision behind this was practical. Although it broke with tradition, Obama's archive broke with tradition, because there simply wasn't enough physical stuff to go into an archive or a library. 95% of the Obama archive is digital, and it's likely that Trump's archive will be similarly constituted. In fact, NARA have already opened the Trump Presidential Library online, and here it is. And this isn't a spoof, this is on the National Archives, the NARA website right now, and you can go and have a look at it. So what does this all tell us? Well, we want to keep archives as a historical record, yes, but it also reinforces their relevance in the present. It reinforces their symbolic role, their role in memorialisation, their potential to hold individuals and administrations to account, their different formats, the rise of the digital, the possibility of gaps in the archive. And given the conversations, particularly during the Trump administration, about post-truth and fake news, I think this raises the potentially ambiguous relationship between archives and trust and the truth. And I'll mention something about that later on. It highlights to me the importance of archivists dealing with current records as well as records of the past. In short, this example tells us a lot about archives. It tells us a lot about the power of archives, and it tells us about the archivist's role in this. Now, I've been reading a book recently that deals with these issues over the centuries, and which I very much enjoyed. And this is the book. A lot of you may have heard of this. It's written by Richard Ovenden, and he was a librarian at Edinburgh, and he's now the Bodleian librarian. And for me, this is a masterly summary of the importance of libraries and archives under threat. He talks a lot about archives and power, so I thought it might be interesting just to summarise some of the things that he says before going on to look at how I feel this impacts on me personally as an archivist. So Ovenden explores how war and neglect, for example, has led to a loss of knowledge, particularly in the ancient world, and he looks at the decline of great libraries such as the one in Alexandria. He discusses how a particular knowledge or a particular culture or a particular community or a particular way of life can be purposefully targeted. He gives the example of during the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries and the subsequent destruction of their libraries and archives. Incidentally, he mentions antiquarians who are credited with saving at least some of this material, even though they weren't always appreciated by their contemporaries. He gives this great definition of an antiquarian from a 1698 dictionary. I'll just let you read that. So to go on, Ovenden clearly demonstrates the connection between collections of archives and libraries and individuals and communities' sense of identity. And he recounts numerous occasions when that identity has been threatened due to deliberate destruction. He talks, for example, about the war during the 1990s in former Yugoslavia, when the Serbs deliberately destroyed Bosnian library and archive sites. It's estimated that they destroyed at least 2 million volumes and 480,000 metres of archives in the hope of destroying the Bosnian culture itself. Ovenden also describes how archives and records have often been collected and used as instruments of control. He gives examples again, including the East German Stasi files. And he looks at how these collections can subsequently be used to hold these organisations and institutions to account, a fact that's been recognised by regimes who often hurry to destroy their records before a transfer of power, as was the case with apartheid South Africa, for example. And those of you who are archivists have probably heard or read Vern Harris talking about how difficult it was for the archivists at the National Archives during the transfer of power in South Africa. when they were asked to destroy records, and some of them in fact didn't. Some of them hid some of the government records. And for some countries, particularly those going through independence, records aren't necessarily destroyed, but they are withdrawn. Many of you will remember the 2012 outcry when it was discovered that the British government had destroyed records relating to a group of Kenyans who'd been delayed and tortured during the Mau Mau rebellion. They'd either destroyed these records or they'd hidden the records in a secret Foreign Office archive. And the issue here is not only was the British government trying to hide evidence of shameful activity, but they've also removed these records from the context in which they were created and from the country in which they were created, and arguably from the country to which they belong. And there are many conversations in the archive world just now about displaced and removed archives, just as there are in the museum world. And this is another example that Ovenden talks about, the Ba'ath Party archives after the Iraq invasion. This man here is called Kanyan Makia. He was a scholar and he was a campaigner against Saddam Hussein. And he really did have one of those experiences where he opened a door and stumbled upon a hidden archive in post-invasion Iraq. This was the Ba'ath Party archive, and it was dynamite, as he said. The archive was transferred, this was in 2003 he found this. The archive was transferred to the United States for safekeeping. Ovenden talks about it being used by the US Department of Defense, and this is where this gets very complicated. Many people in Iraq and many US archivists and other archivists have argued that this wasn't an act of safekeeping, but this was a simple act of plunder. And in fact, it wasn't until 2020 that this archive was fully returned to Iraq, and this is the Wall Street Journal describing this. Coming back to the Mau Mau point, to my mind, there's a further issue here as well. So as well as the importance of these records in terms of keeping the British government, holding the British government to account, or documenting a community or a historical event, this will be one of the places that this group of Kenyans, one of the only places in which they can be remembered, in which they are recorded, in which these people appear. And I think that's really important to remember, that archives are powerful, but they are often created by the powerful who decide what needs to be recorded and what needs to be remembered. Many voices don't appear in archives. Many people are not remembered. And archives are perhaps as much about forgetting as they are about remembering. So go away and read the book. It's a great book. But it got me thinking about, what does all this mean for me as an archivist in Dundee University? Well, perhaps three main things. Firstly, I'm not just an archivist in Dundee University, but I'm part of a global community with an interest in archives everywhere. And this is a community that worldwide is ensuring that archives are preserved and accessible. So that's why I think bodies like the International Council on Archives are really important. The ICA is a professional body for archivists and for records keepers, and it advocates for the importance of archives. As you can see here from the Universal Declaration on Archives that was produced in 2011, talks about archives being unique and irreplaceable, being passed from generation to generation, having value and meaning, being authoritative, underpinning accountability and transparency for administrations, playing an essential role in the development of societies, and safeguarding and contributing individual and community memory. It talks about archives and access to archives enriching our societies and promoting democracy, protecting citizens' rights, and enhancing the quality of life. Archives and power. absolutely. And the ICA, the International Council on Archives, also produces practical tools, for example, looking at displaced archives and where they are, producing tools such as managing archives at risk. And its section on archives and human rights produces a regular newsletter, monthly in fact, which highlights the use of archives in supporting human rights and revealing human rights abuses. Secondly, I think I can raise awareness of the power of archives myself. In teaching undergraduates and postgraduates, we obviously teach traditional research skills, but we also emphasise the broader societal role of archives. Last semester, for example, we had a group of politics and international relations and history students who were master's students, and they were looking at the broad theme of social justice. And I was able to introduce them to the idea of archives contributing to this. We discussed a range of issues of how records and archives are important, and we looked at, for example, we talked about the Rohingya experiences in Myanmar and how the people, particularly in minorities, are often not just forgotten by the state, but evidence of their activities is purposely destroyed by the state. So in this example, the Rohingya people found themselves being stripped of their citizenship, but also documentation and registration documents were destroyed. So that has an impact on them individually, obviously, but also as on their existence, on the way we remember them as a community. And thirdly, I think, while ideas of community and transparency and accountability and representation and justice are very kind of big words and very big concepts, they have a very personal application, and that applies wherever you are in the world. So I try and use my understanding of the power of archives to inform what I do on a day-to-day basis. So this might be in how we use archives. So for example, my colleagues Jan and Sharon, and sorry Jan and Sharon, if you're watching this, I haven't asked your permission to use this image of you, but I'm sure you won't mind because it's a great image. It's Jan and Sharon doing some great reminiscence work with groups using our archive material. And this really fostered a sense of identity and a sense of community amongst these groups of people. And what I think is really important is that it fostered a sense of worth as well. Archivists amongst you, don't worry, I know you're staring very hard at those cups of tea and those biscuits, but the archives that we were using here were actually copies rather than anything else. During the pandemic, archivists all over the country have been going into their repositories as essential workers in a way, because they are currently actively holding individuals and institutions to account by providing evidence to child abuse inquiries. And in fact, just before lockdown, we were visited for a week by a group of lawyers who were working on the infected blood inquiry and using our archives as evidence in that. At the university, we're also very aware that we need to re-examine what we collect and to make sure that a range of people's roles are preserved in the archives and a range of people's voices are preserved in the archives. And we're addressing this through oral history projects. We're trying to record the stories and experiences of people in Dundee. And this just doesn't necessarily mean old people, it can also mean young people as well. And I'm sorry, please, people who know Sheila Wellington, don't say I called her old, but there's a difference in ages here anyway. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about our work with people with learning disabilities and mental health issues. This is Bobby, who I very much enjoyed showing around the archives. Bobby was a former resident at Strathmartin Hospital, which catered for people with learning disabilities. And Bobby came to the archives to remember his history, to find out about his history, to reconnect with a sense of his life that had gone before, to add a little bit to his sense of identity and his sense of belonging to a community. And he was so excited by the archives, you can see him here being excited, that he actually made a film about the history of Strathmartin Hospital using the archive material. You see, these projects that we've been involved with speak directly to issues of community and issues of accountability and issues of rights and issues of representation. We look, for example, at the provision of care in the past, and we use that to inform discussions about provision of care today. And the archives kind of give a safe space for people to talk about difficult issues. They allow people to have a voice, they allow people to reflect on their own experiences, and when appropriate we've recorded those voices, we've recorded those experiences for the archives so that people feel valued and so that people know that their voices will be listened to now and will be heard in the future. We've been fortunate enough to be able to invite mental health service users to some of the classes that we've done with mental health nursing students. We use the archives, for example, to discuss restraint and seclusion in the past and how restraint is managed today. And this reinforced the fact that everybody's voice has a value. And this is just a tweet that one of the nursing staff did after one of the sessions that we did with nursing students. And I think that idea of everybody's voices having value is really important. I'll just move this a little bit so that you can see the quotation, and also I'm smaller, so that's quite nice. These are two quotations from some of the mental health service users that came along to the archives. First thing to say is that they didn't think they could come to the archives, they didn't think they could come to the university, they didn't think that kind of thing was for them, they didn't think they were allowed. And I'll just let you read the first quotation just now. So this is that idea of archives having an impact on the present. You know, having a connection with the past gives you a greater understanding about where you are today. These people in the past came alive, but it got her buzzing, and she felt better than she's felt for a very long time. The second quotation is in the context of looking at how archives can impact on decisions that we make today. Looking at how people were cared for in the past might give us ideas about caring for patients today. And this particular mental health service user said it's really important that we carry on the excellent work of our predecessors, i.e. the archivists, collecting things, and carry on keeping records for future generations. Who knows, one day we might just get it right, i.e. get mental health care right, because we can be informed by the past. So this person is carrying on keeping records, talking about carrying on keeping records, and I've mentioned a few times now that records are likely to be digital. So that's what I'm going to go on and talk about now. And I'm going to look at a number of issues that this new digital environment raises for archivists. Firstly, let's look at a fairly well documented case study, that of Twitter. Now in 2010, the Library of Congress announced that it was going to be preserving all of the tweets that ever existed. It was basically capturing Twitter as an archive. And we can now have a look at the blog that the Library of Congress produced at the time. I'm not sure how clear this is going to be on your screen, so I'm going to read some of the comments, because I think these comments actually perfectly sum up some of the issues that the digital environment throws up for archivists and throws up for society in general. So the first comment: I think this is downright awesome. I'm part of a legacy I'm part of a generation, leaving a legacy like others before. Thank you, Library of Congress. So yeah, I'm going to be in the archives of the future. Fantastic. Second comment, the question now is, who is the copyright holder, Twitter or the person involved in the tweet? So lots of issues in terms of ownership in the digital environments. Third comment, archiving the ephemeral and the meaningless. Yeah, why do we archive tweets? They're not official records. Why should we be interested in social media? Fourth comment, excuse my language, this is bollocks. What right does the government have to my tweets or other people's private tweets? Well, that person obviously doesn't understand what Twitter is. But yeah, there is a point there about people using social media for one thing and not realising that it's going to be around potentially forever and other people are going to access it. Fifth comment, you have 167 terabytes of web info. Do you have a backup? So that points to the surprising fragility of the digital environment, but also the potentially massive amounts of data that there is. Sixth comment, my tax dollars are paying for this, you can't be serious. So who gets to decide where the country's resources are in terms of creating an archive and what's kept and what's not kept? It goes on and on and on. I'll just do one more that's quite interesting as well. Number 11, Tim says, this is very cool. Will it be searchable and accessible to the general public? Yeah. A really difficult thing in terms of the digital environment is how to provide meaningful access to it. And whether we should provide access to it in terms of privacy and so on. Tim goes on to say that he's leery of private organisations having increasing control over our public and private discourse, so it's refreshing to see the Library of Congress taking the lead in archiving this information. And that's something that Richard Ovenden in his book talks about as well, and I'm going to come back to talk about that in a little while. So that's what the Library of Congress decided to do, great fanfares. Several years passed, we didn't hear anything. We had occasional updates saying they're still working on it, until finally in 2017 the Library of Congress announces it will no longer archive every tweet. Basically, it's just too difficult. It's just too difficult to deal with all those issues, particularly the issue of size, the problem of providing meaningful access to that amount of material, and the difficulty in terms of ethics and privacy and so on. So that's one case study that raises a number of issues that we're all having to deal with just now. The second one that I want to show you or talk about is the Syrian Archive. Now this is really, really interesting. This is a group of people who've got together to save material that basically they feel documents human rights violations in Syria. So this is all sorts of material, including news reports, lots of social media activity, stuff filmed on mobile phones, and they're getting it all together. And it's really useful in indicating how a current archive is made from a variety of different types of material. It's really useful in thinking about how perhaps archives today can only be made by collaboration. It's also really useful in thinking about vulnerability in the digital environment, because this is run by a not-for-profit organisation. So what's its longevity? What's going to happen to it in the future? And when you look at who is involved in this, the team working on the Syrian Archive is comprised of, we've got researchers, we've got journalists, we've got historians, we've got technologists, we've got digital security experts. We've not got archivists. Archivists aren't involved at all. So is this an issue? And where do archivists stand if people take on archiving themselves? And we've had examples of that just this year. So during the Capitol Hill riot, a lot of the people involved filmed themselves and then posted this on social media, in particular on this social media platform Parler, which a lot of the pro-Trump supporters used. Then they decided actually maybe it wasn't a good idea to have evidence of their activities out there in the world. So they deleted a lot of their posts. But in the meantime, as you can see from these headlines here, archivists had gone in and captured them. But actually, these aren't archivists in the sense of professional archivists. But at least this material has been preserved. This is actually a pure form of community archiving that anyone who's done an archive course recently will know that we're all encouraged to support community archives. But perhaps as professionals, there are issues if we rely on others to do this kind of thing. We're at their mercy in terms of what they decide to preserve, and we're at the mercy of vulnerable technology. We're at the risk of things becoming obsolescent, things not being accessible, or things just being lost in that kind of huge terabyte after terabyte after terabyte of data. Archiving initiatives have been springing up online ever since there was an online, but many might be short-lived. This is the Occupy Wall Street archive movement, or the Occupy movement archive, that's available online. I'll just show you the front page. So here you can see the Occupy archive was actually last contributed to in 2012. And while this is hosted obviously by it says here the Rosenberg Centre for History and New Media, I do wonder what's going to happen to it and similar initiatives in the future. In fact, I often use this as an example, and other people, not me, have written about this as a really good example of archives and forgetting, because one of the reasons that this site hasn't been heavily used is that a lot of the people involved in the Occupy movement were people who did not like records being created. They did not like official bureaucratic processes. They did not want to be recorded. They wanted to protest, they wanted to demonstrate, but they did not want to be archived. And that's a really interesting thought, that archives are about forgetting because of the things that have been destroyed, but archives are also about forgetting because people don't want to be remembered. We can't even guarantee that information that is held by well-established sites is going to be preserved. So again, this is one that you might remember. Flickr suddenly decided that it was going to limit the amount of free storage that it provided to users. It was only going to allow 1,000 images. So a lot of people lost a lot of images because they didn't give people very long to move them to another site. And Richard Ovenden actually discusses this, and he also discusses his concern in general that the internet is becoming a sort of library, a sort of archive, and particular sites on the internet are taking on this role of archive or library, and that these happen to be commercial companies. And is there a danger in that our information, our knowledge, our archives are being controlled by a few commercial companies? You'll all have seen headlines, articles like this about the amount of data that is stored on us, about the power of some of these social media sites, about who's doing the controlling, who's controlling elections, who's controlling what is news and what is fake news. So real issues, and Richard Ovenden feels that because of this, libraries and archives are more important than ever, and I would agree with him. But why? What can we do? Well, as archivists, as record keepers, we understand the issues about collecting data, about collecting records, about collecting archives, and in particular about providing access to this in terms of personal data, in terms of personal information. We're trained in doing this. We're trained in deciding what to keep and what not to keep. Although perhaps I wouldn't be rushing out to keep Bernie Sanders memes, but it's great to think there's the Folklore Archive that is doing this. In fact, in the digital world, just as an aside, for archives there is a difficulty now. We're having conversations about whether we need to actually make that appraisal decision, make that decision about what to keep and what not to keep, because we might, in terms of storage, be able to keep most things. The amount of information that's being produced at the moment, it's very difficult to actually have the time to go through things and decide what to keep and what not to keep. It might be that archivists spend their time thinking about meaningful ways to provide access to this huge range of information, making sure that it's clearly described, making sure that sophisticated search techniques can find what people want to find. So archivists are involved in thinking about access. They're involved in thinking still about what to keep and what not to keep. And archivists understand that we need to be active in ensuring that evidence is recorded and that people's voices are heard. So, for example, archivists have been involved in things like the Truth and Reconciliation commissions that have been going on around the world. This one here at the University of Manitoba is about looking at people in residential schools in Canada, for example. The ex-National Archivist of the United Kingdom, based in Kew, was involved in the Hillsborough inquiry, making sure that the correct evidence was captured and used during the inquiry. And archivists in Australia have created this amazing website called Find and Connect, which is all about helping former child migrants, people in orphanages, looked after children, find information about themselves and information about the people that they were looked after with, or that they were or that were fellow child migrants. So we understand this. We understand that we need to record evidence now. And lots of archivists are campaigning for us to leave behind our sort of neutral curator role and to recognise that the world has changed and that people are understanding more and more about issues of capitalism, about colonialism, about oppression that can occur in the archives and that can occur by using the archives. So those of you who are archivists will know about people like Michelle Caswell, who very much campaigned for us to be committed to end, as she calls, cycles of oppression and to actively fight for human liberation. And finally, let's go back to what I said that I'd mention, which is the truth, the post-truth, the fake news world. Well, I think archivists are important because they understand the importance of evidence. They know that if there are facts, those facts should be preserved, those facts should be made accessible. But we also understand that we need to represent in our collections not only the truth, if there is a truth, but we also need to represent the post-truth world. We also need to represent the world of fake news. And while we're doing this, we need to make sure that we have the proper context so that people will be able to understand who created this, why it was created, when it was created, what the journey is that it has between being created and put in an archive or put in front of a researcher, so that people will be better able to develop an informed opinion about what they're looking at and make their own opinion about whether it's truth or post-truth or fake news. One of the things that I always do with my students is tell them you need to ask those questions. It's not just in a Trump world that we need to question what's the truth and what's not the truth. And just because something is in an archive, it doesn't mean it is the truth. So you wouldn't take the Sun at face value, just as you shouldn't take a newspaper report from the time of the American Civil War. War of Independence at face value. But there's still a need for archivists to retain evidence, to retain the context of that evidence. One of the things that I want to leave you with is a thought from Laura Miller, who's a Canadian archivist, who's written a book called Matter of Facts, The Value of Evidence in an Information Age. And she argues that amongst those reasons that I have stated about the importance of archives, the importance of archivists in terms of understanding issues around access, around privacy, around deciding what to keep, about having the right context, about capturing people's voices, she maintains that archives will retain an evidential value. And in a conversation with Anthea Sellers recently, Anthea Sellers is the Secretary General of the International Council on Archives, there was a conversation that they both did for the Scottish Council on Archives. She mentioned what I thought was a really interesting perception that a lot of people have, that archives are old, records are bureaucratic, and data is ephemeral. But I hope that after having listened to me speak, you will understand that actually archives and records are powerful. They provide evidence of the past, yes, but the evidence of the past is powerful. Archives can have a real impact on what we do today. Archives are important for individuals, they're important for communities, they're important for governments, they're important for preserving evidence, holding people to account, they're important for justice. And I would like to think that archivists will continue to be important to ensure that this evidence, whatever its format, whether it's a piece of paper from the 18th century, a piece of papyrus from 10 AD, a film, a book, a social media account, I like to think that archivists will continue to play a role in this. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we're going to have questions now.